Welcome to the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley, psychology student and international best-selling psychology author of over 30 psychology books, bringing you the latest psychology news, fascinating psychology topics and more each week. If you want to learn more, then please check out connorwhiteley.net/books. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the YouTube video or follow on your favourite podcast app. And here's the show. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 314 of the Psychology World podcast with me, Con Whiteley. And today's episode is on what is educational psychology. And it is Thursday, 15th of March 2025 as I record this. So apologies if my voice sounds a little off. It turns out I'm just getting a brand new code, which I'm not impressed about. In fact, I've actually just tried to sniff, and I've managed to blow out my own ears slightly. So my ears have just popped, which is not a pleasant feeling. So going back to the topic at hand, educational psychology is a brilliant area of psychology which I've never really thought about too much because I never really wanted to work with children. I never thought about it. I never really thought about how psychology can be applied to educational settings, besides from what's being required of my course content. However, something that happens when you're a postgraduate is that different psychological services can actually email your School of Psychology. So on Monday, I got a job advertisement for Assistant Educational Psychologist. And the interesting thing about that job was that the only experience they required was that you needed to work with the children for 1 year full time, which was absolutely brilliant for me. I've been working with the children part-time for 6 years, so I more than meet that requirement. So I'm definitely going to apply for that job because it has a September 1st start date, which will be perfect for me because it's a 2-year fixed-term contract. That means I might be able to get a job. It might be one that I really enjoy, and then hopefully that can give me the clinical experience needed to be able to apply for the doctorate of clinical psychology in the future. So I really hope that I get it, but of course, well, I probably won't, but it's just about starting the job application process and always saying yes to opportunities whenever they come along. However, the reason why I'm doing this a podcast episode is because, well, it turns out I don't know that much about educational psychology. If I want to become an assistant educational psychologist, I should probably learn what it is. So that's what we're going to do with today's episode. So by the end of it, we're going to understand what is educational psychology, what educational psychologists study, what are the career routes involved in educational psychology, and so many more great topics that I flat out love. So you're definitely going to learn a lot from this. And you got that to look forward to in the content part of today's episode. So moving on to the psychology news section, we're reading from the British Psychological Society Research Digest. And the first one is, are you a boomer asker? Person A, what's the craziest thing you've ever swum with? Person B, I haven't really swum with anything crazy, probably just fish. Person A, yeah, last year I swam with a giant manta ray. It was incredible. Many of us will have the experience of being person B in this type of conversation. If you have a tendency to be like person A though, this makes you a boom asker, someone who asks a question, let the other person respond, but then the question immediately turns to them like a boomerang. According to a new paper in the Journal of Experimental Psychology General, which documents the phenomenon, boom askers think they're leaving a good impression on the person they're talking to, but they're mistaken. Okay, so in terms of social psychology, this is definitely quite an interesting one because we have all been in these type of situations, and they're really weird because So my experience of being a person B is that someone who tends to be of a higher socioeconomic status of me, or someone who thinks they're a lot better than me, they asked me a like question, for example, where I went to school, some psychology stuff, and X, Y, and Z, and basically I answer, I give them a vague answer because I have no experiences of what they're asking me, and then they give me some impressive detail about their lives, their research, or where they went to school, or some amazing holiday that they went on. Okay, that is a bit weird and it seems boastful and prideful, and it's just not very nice. And it makes that person look really full of themselves. Selves And of course, like we all want to make ourselves seem quite good and quite impressive, but I think it's about how you would do it. For example, from time to time, and I don't really do this often because I don't like drawing attention to it, but I don't tend to mention my books in my podcast because people tend to think that's really impressive, and then they ask me a million and one like questions which I don't always want to answer in a public. So I definitely don't mind it. But then equally though, like there are different situations where I do want to see more in impressive. For example, like yesterday I was on a date, and what happened was that we were talking about different life like experiences. So I spoke about my international work, me going to a like royal birthday party. But that wasn't boastful because in the context it made a perfect sense because we were talking about life experiences and the different bits of impressive stuff that we've done. So it really is about how you ask it, how do you introduce information, and that is what makes you leave a good or bad impression. So the second one is the cycle of narcissism and ostracization. Those with narcissistic tendencies are often viewed as being a cause of other people's suffering. In the past few years, there's been a growing trend of labelling those who wrong someone as a narcissist, and as such, commonly held definitions of narcissism are becoming somewhat fuzzy, often reducing narcissists down to a capsulet. One of the things that popular understanding of narcissism often overlooks is the fact that those that high in the narcissistic trait suffer too. Not only do they find themselves longing for unattainable levels of admiration and recognition, but according to recent research in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, they're more susceptible to feeling and being ostracized by others. Okay, so this is quite a good one because it does show that narcissism does lead to this really weird cycle. Because as a narcissist, what you want is you will want people to love you, you will want people to admire you, you want people to think that you're God, that you're amazing, and that you're perfect, and you want your brilliance to be recognized. So you do a lot of stuff to try and make that happen. But then when people realize how much of a narcissist you are, then they tend to avoid you, ostracize you, and they tend to cut you out because they don't want to be around a narcissist. So that leads to ostracization, which makes the narcissist even further away from their goals of attaining this so-called perfect level of admiration and recognition. So they have to go back into the cycle to try and like redeem themselves, which then leads to further ostracization. So it's definitely interesting, and I think what would be an interesting next step is what do we do with this information? Information though, like is there some sort of program? Is there some sort of intervention we can make for narcissists to try and help them break this cycle? Because I know there are different workbooks, different types of therapy that help with narcissistic tendencies. But what about this cycle of narcissism and ostracization? Would this be a good, I don't know, behavioral experiment? or something that we can use, or maybe even some psychoeducation to help show someone who's in denial about the damaging impact of their narcissistic tendencies. Could this be a good reminder to them saying, no, like this is impacting your life? And if you want to break this cycle, and if you do want people to admire you and not ostracize you, then you might need to help break out of this cycle. So it'd be good to see what the clinical implications of this article are. So the last one is amyloid beta, from foe to friend. Most readers familiar with Alzheimer's will be familiar with the idea that the amyloid plaque plays an important role in Alzheimer's pathology, but our understanding of exactly what that role is may have just been flipped by a recent study in brain. The research by Jesus Albone at the University of Cincinnati and a colleague suggests that it's not only so much the formation of the distinctive plaques or clumps of amyloid beta 42 that harms cognition, but rather the reduction in the normal non-plaque form of this protein. Oh wow, okay then. Like, as long-term listeners of the podcast know, I don't look at the news articles before I record the podcast. But if that's true, that is quite groundbreaking, because we all know that Alzheimer's, any form of dementia, is caused by this build-up of these proteins. But the idea that that's wrong is stunning, because that would flip everything on its head. Like, the entire field of Alzheimer's research would just be flipped on its head. Like, I don't even know what this would mean. So if the reduction in the normal non-plaque form of this protein is actually what harms cognition, okay, then that would mean that we would have to really focus on maybe not so much reducing this plaque form of this protein, but instead increasing the amount of the non-plaque form. And I don't know if that would be easier as a way to solve dementia, or harder, because right now we're all currently focusing on how to prevent this plaque build-up of these proteins at all. But if we instead focus on not so much reducing or getting rid of this plaque build-up, because for a moment, let's accept that's a normal bit of pathological aging that we cannot avoid. But if there's a way to increase the non-plaque form of this protein, if that's more manageable, and if that is actually what causes the cognitive decline, that might be revolutionary. That might make Alzheimer's treatment so much more accessible and easier to some extent. Okay, as you can see, I'm honestly quite stunned, but this is interesting. And me and my partner yesterday, we were talking about dementia and Alzheimer's. I might bring this up tonight. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, that is stunning. Okay, I'm actually quite mind blown. Interesting. And thankfully, I didn't sniff once during the reading of this article, so that's going to make editing this a bit easier. So I really hope that you enjoy the psychology news section. So let's move on to the personal update. So we're moving on to the personal update. So this week has been a lot of fun, and I've definitely learned a few bits and pieces from this week. So first of all, if you are doing work again compared to last week, do not give yourself way more to do on your to-do list. But it was a lot of fun doing like lots of different projects. I haven't really focused on psychology as much as I have in like a previous week, so because I've been focusing on like a fiction project, but I've also been doing quite a lot more of the clinical psychology reflections, which have been a lot of fun because Wednesday I was working and there were lots of gaps during like my working day. But I just had to do some writing in instead because that will be like a lot of fun. So I did that, and the interesting bit about the work that I was doing was that I was working at a local college and I was doing what's known as a progression interviews. So these are like 16 or 17-year-olds who are coming. We ask them questions about what do they want to do in the future, and then if they've got a career goal in mind, we check if they know how to like get there. We refer them to the careers team, like etc. So just about trying like to get younger people to think about their options, what they might want to do, and whether they need to go to university or not. So it was a lot of fun. I had some really good conversations with various students. And then I was doing like reading support academic stuff, and I took part in a psychology study this week too. So it was with an AI chatbot, which you could ask questions and everything, and it's a chatbot designed to basically help train clinical psychologists. And the interesting thing about it was that it is very good in terms of getting you to think about the sort of questions you want to ask, asking about follow-up questions and other bits and pieces, and interpreting what a client is saying, even if the client is AI. But it will never replace a human interaction because I can't see how the client is responding. I can't actually think about their body language, their tone of voice, and like bits and pieces of like that. But my main issue with it was that after a while, because I was typing and I knew this wasn't a real client, and I only had 12 minutes to actually do this study, I actually got a bit lazy because I didn't respond to what the client was saying. I didn't try and think about the wording of my questions. I was a little blunt towards at the end because it was just quite dull to keep typing out the like questions because I didn't have the engagement or because I didn't have the client sitting in front of me. That was my issue. So it was interesting. It was useful. I'm taking part in the second part of the study in 2 days' time. So I definitely want to learn more because I do think that this is the future of clinical psychology in terms of AI will play a role in it. I just don't know how big that role should be. Personally, at this point in time, I don't think it should play a massive role, but of course, this is out of my hands for the large bit. This is down to the psychology organisations and so on. So, just some food for thought. And in a personal note, I went on my first ever date yesterday. It was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. Me and this person spoke for like 3 hours straight. So we ordered food. Originally, I was only gonna make it last 2 hours because I was busy, and that's basically mine and this person's problem. We're so busy that we can't actually see each other like that often though. But we kept talking. I was a little late for something, but it was like a great fun. We spoke about the interest in anthropology, our families, mental health stuff, our research, etc. So a lot of fun. At least I can say I've actually been on a date now. So 23 years old and my first ever date, which lots of people find quite shocking. But I was like, I'm traumatized, okay? I have a lot of trauma to work through and a lot of life experiences. So, as always, I always love to hear your thoughts and feelings on today's episode. So, you can always email me, connorwhiteley@connorwhiteley.net. You can always leave a comment at the show notes at connorwhiteley.net/podcast. And you can always tweet me on Twitter at sci-fi Whiteley. I always love to hear from all of you because it really helps make the podcast feel more like a conversation. And you can always leave a comment on the Facebook post or LinkedIn post. And please send in pictures of where you're listening in from. I always love to see where all of you are all over the world. And today's episode has been sponsored by retrieval-based learning. And this is a really fun, really brilliant book that is actually based on my final year dissertation. The reason why this is a great sponsor for today's episode is because educational psychology really does focus on how do people learn and what is the learning process. So how do biological but also the learning in environment impact our learning process, and how can we make people the best possible learners that they are. And retrieval-based learning is definitely one of these brilliant ways that is really effective though. Like, I saw people who knew no Japanese symbols whatsoever, ever, managed to get 100 Japanese symbol in a minute after like a few days of using this retrieval-based learning task. So it's really interesting, it's really effective, and there are so many fascinating biological and also psychological underpinnings of how this learning works. So I could talk about it for ages because this is my dissertation project. I love it. I also talk about the transfer effect, my results, the discussion, and this is just such a brilliant topic that I really do recommend that you will learn about, because whether you want to know about educational psychology or not, knowing about retrieval-based learning and why it's so effective is actually critical to all learning, whether regardless of the subdiscipline that you're in the future. So there's retrieval-based learning, available from all major ebook retailers, and you can order the paperback and the hardback version from Amazon, your local bookstore or local library if you request it. And if you want the audiobook narrated by artificial intelligence, now you can. Add selected audiobook retailers like Spotify, Kobo, Google Play, Barnes & Noble, and selected library systems like Baker & Taylor, Overdrive, and Biblioteca. So whilst buying books helps to support the creation and the editing of the podcast, my time is sponsored by my wonderful patrons. And as always, a massive thank you to my patrons. Your support shows that you like the show and you want it to continue. And if you want to get tons of great rewards and build a better relationship between me as the creator and you as the listener, then please head on over to patreon.com. And one of the great benefits of becoming a patron is that you will get access to tons, and I think this is like 50, easily like coming up to 50 or 60 blog posts and psychology articles that will not be made available to other people in forms of podcast episodes for weeks or months, or to be honest, even years in the future. So if you want access to tons of great psychological content that is exclusive to a patron, then please head on over to patreon.com/The Psychology World Podcast. Or if you want to support the podcast on a one-off basis, now you can at buymeacoffee.com/Connor Whiteley. So that's enough for the personal update. Let's move on to the content part of today's episode. So we'll move on to the content part of today's episode. So we're going to be talking about what is educational psychology. And this is a lot of fun, it's really useful, and this is definitely a very insightful podcast episode into an area of psychology that we just don't tend to talk about very much. So let's dive into it. What is educational psychology? So, educational psychology is the empirical study of how we learn and retain information. This area of psychology mainly focuses on the learning processes in early childhood as well as adolescence, but as learning is lifelong, it can focus on adults too. Also, it's important to bear in mind that even though educational psychology sounds like it only focuses on education settings, learning takes place through life experiences like the home, family, friends, work, culture, and through social media. Therefore, educational psychology investigates how learning can occur in all of these different situations. Furthermore, when it comes to educational psychologists, these psychologists study the biological, cognitive, social, and emotional factors that underpin learning, as well as deepen our understanding of individual learning styles, the importance of having learning in environments, and in instructional strategies. The entire point of educational psychology is to help people learn in the best way possible. Educational psychologists can specialize in children with specific learning difficulties or neurodevelopmental conditions, as well as educational psychologists can develop teaching materials to help students reach their full potential in schools. I know the Assistant Educational Psychologist position I'm going to apply for focuses on working with children with autism and specific learning difficulties, whereas a woman who I used to know, she did work experience in an educational psychology role, helping to do assessments for children with special educational needs, and she loved it. What topics can educational psychologists study? So, if you want to become an educational psychologist, there are a lot of different topics and areas you could work in and study. For example, you could work in organizational learning, where you study how people learn in organizational settings, like the workplace. I think this sounds great to some extent, because if you have a burning passion for business psychology, but you're interested in learning too, then this is a great way to combine both the topics. Also, this just goes to show how psychology can constantly be combined and applied in so many unexpected ways, because I never would have thought to combine learning and the workplace. Another topic you could study as an educational psychologist is educational technology, by looking at how different types of technology can help students learn. I would add that you could see what types of technology improves people's ability to learn the best. I imagine that for some people, artificial intelligence could be useful, but for other learners, they might find virtual reality more useful. It is a random idea, but these are the sort of fun egg experiments and research questions you can investigate in educational psychology. In addition, educational psychologists can work in instructional design, so they can research how to effectively design learning materials for different students based on their learning style, their age, their cognitive development, and whether or not they have any special educational needs. Personally, a small part of me would not mind working in this area. It definitely wouldn't be my forever job, but it would be interesting to see how this works in more depth. Also, I do have egg experience in this area, because as part of being a postgraduate and ambassador for my university, I already developed age appropriate material for students at different ages, and it is a lot of fun. I flat out love it. It's so much fun creating different sort of psychology material and pitching it for different age groups. The final three options that we'll look at in this podcast episode, but there are more available in the real world, are educational psychologists could be involved in curriculum development by creating coursework that maximizes a person's ability to learn, as well as they can work with gifted learners, so educational psychologists can support learners who are identified as gifted. Lastly, psychologists can work with children and young people with special educational needs by providing them with specialized instructions. And that's something that I've seen a few times in the real world, especially during my work experience with an NHS learning disability team, because I went to a college that had a centre for people with special educational needs, and it was useful to see how staff spoke, broke down tasks, and interacted with each student. It's hard to explain briefly in a paragraph, but it was useful to see how instructions needed to be adapted so the student could effectively understand what was being asked of them. What psychological perspectives does educational psychology draw on? Like most of psychology, educational psychology draws on a lot of different psychological theories, research, and practices from other areas of psychology. For example, educational psychology draws on theories and research from behavioral psychology, developmental psychology, cognitive psychology, and more. At the time of writing, within educational psychology, there are about 5 main schools of thought, which we'll look at in more depth in a moment. These are cognitivism, behaviorism, constructivism, social contextual learning theories, and experientialism. It's important to be aware of each of these main perspectives because each one has their own focus on specific factors that influence a person's learning ability, whether this is through influences on experiences, behaviours, emotions, thoughts, and more. What is the cognitive perspective in educational psychology? So, the cognitive perspective has to be one of the most widespread theories in educational psychology, as it accounts for a wide range of different factors that impact learning. For example, the cognitive perspective accounts for the effects of thinking, memory formation, information processing, and more, unlike other perspectives. Therefore, in learning and cognitive psychology, this perspective focuses on how constructs like emotions, motivation, individual perspectives, and beliefs impact the learning process. Then, this cognitive theory is supported by the idea that a person learns because of their own intrinsic motivation that has nothing to do with external rewards, as a behaviourist would see learning. More on that in a moment. As a result, educational psychologists use the cognitive perspective to understand what motivates children and young people to learn, how they problem solve, and how children remember what they've learned, amongst other topics. What is the behaviourist perspective in educational psychology? So, our second perspective proposes that all of our behaviours are learned through conditioning, like negative reinforcement. Behavioural psychologists who believe in the behaviourist perspective firmly rely on the principle of offering conditioning to explain how learning happens. In essence, behaviourism suggests that teachers reward students with tokens or another desirable outcome or stimulus, and this motivates the student to learn. Also, if the teacher punishes a student for doing bad behaviour, then the student learns not to do that in the future. Within educational psychology, behaviourism is understood to be somewhat useful, with the idea of rewarding students teaches them good behaviour. Yet behaviourism has thankfully been heavily criticised for not acknowledging or taking into account for the internal psychological motivations of a child or young person, like intrinsic motivation, rewards, as well as attitudes. Personally, I'm a good example of why the behaviourist approach isn't completely right, because I love learning about psychology, I love podcasting, and learning everything I possibly can. But this isn't because a teacher is rewarding me for learning about psychology, but because it brings me joy. It is my passion, and I would hate not to learn about psychology and other topics. What is the developmental perspective in educational psychology? Just like developmental psychology, the developmental perspective investigates how our biology, cognitive, social, and emotional development impacts our learning throughout the lifetime. Therefore, in an educational psychology context, this helps us to understand how children and young people learn new knowledge and skills as they grow up and develop. Now, personally, as much as I flat out hate the nature versus nurture debate, because research clearly shows most behaviours are a mixture of the two, with one type of factor being the dominant influence and the other being a smaller factor, but still influencing the behaviour. When it comes to educational psychology, there is still a focus on the impact of nature versus nurture on the learning process. For instance, as the brain develops, so does a child's capacity to learn, remember, and problem solve. These are the biological factors. Yet, at the same time, too, from their life experiences with peers, teachers, family, parents, and other important people in their life, those are the environmental factors that impact learning. A good theory to look at here is Gina Piaget's stages of cognitive development model that explains how children grow intellectually throughout childhood, and you can read more about that theory and more in my book, Developmental Psychology, A Guide to Developmental and Child Psychology, available in all the usual places. On the whole, educational psychologists use the developmental perspective to understand how children think at different stages of their development, so they can better understand what children are capable of learning at each developmental stage. In turn, this helps educators to create instructional materials and methods that are appropriate for each age group. What is the experiential perspective? So, the experiential, I know I'm butchering that and I do apologise, perspective focuses on how a person's life experiences impacts how they learn and understands new information. In addition, this perspective considers emotions, feelings, and experiences similar to the cognitive and constructionist perspectives too. Then, this perspective helps educational psychologists to understand how learners find personal meaning in their education instead of feeling that the information doesn't apply to them. And in case you don't think that this is important to understand, because you believe children and young people think everything they learn is important to them, just think about your maths lessons as a child. How many times did you sit in algebra wondering when you were going to use this? When I was writing up this blog post, it was only last night I was having a conversation with a friend about how useless algebra was, and she didn't agree with me at all. And I don't really remember much about algebra because I still don't think it applies to me. And as educators, that reaction from students is the last thing that we want, which was something that I actually learned during my pathological training through my university for my postgrad ambassador job. Due to one of the 4 pathological outcomes is the value of learning. So it's important to show students that's what the learning is relevant and important to them, as well as they can use it in the real world. This helps to improve in engagement, and it shows them they should focus and remember what they learned today. And in my psychology content for my university, I've always included short sections at the end and throughout my content that remind students why this is important and why they should value what they're learning today. What is the constructionist perspective? The constructionist approach is definitely an area of psychology that I want to learn more about. I flat out love this approach as it accounts for social and cultural influences on our behaviour. In this case, our learning behaviour. As a result, someone who believes in the constructionist approach proposes that what a person already knows significantly influences how they will learn new information. In other words, new knowledge can only be added to and understood in terms of existing knowledge, with the perspective relying heavily on the work of Tchaikovsky with his ideas on the zone of proximal development as well as instructional scaffolding. In my opinion, I largely agree with this theory, because last week is a good example of the constructionist approach. Since I live and breathe for clinical psychology through my lectures, my books, and my podcast, I can largely walk into any psychology lecture and understand and learn information. I make links between what I currently know and the new information that I'm learning in the lecture. Whereas last week, I went to my housemate's second year atomic physics lecture and I did not understand any of it whatsoever. I know it was talking about a periodic table, but that was all that I understood, because I haven't got any past information besides what I learned at my GCSE, so when I was about 16 years old. I couldn't remember or learn any of this atomic physics information, because I had no pre-existing knowledge. What are educational psychology careers? So, if you like the sound of educational psychology, then there are a lot of potential career options for you. For example, the majority of educational psychologists work directly in schools because some psychologists are teachers, where other educational psychologists help teachers try new learning methods as well as develop new course content. Another career option as an educational psychologist is to work in academic research, where you conduct research on different topics within learning. Or you could work in administration, where you can influence educational methods and help students learn in the best possible way for them. A final career option within educational psychology is to become a counsellor, where you would directly help students cope with any barriers to learning that they face. Lastly, for this section, to be able to become an educational psychologist, you need to have a bachelor's and a master's degree, as well as if you want to work in a school administration or at a university, then you might need a doctorate. And if you're a UK listener, then at the time of writing, the Doctorate of Educational Psychology is fully funded. Conclusion. Personally, because I do a lot of work in schools for my university's outreach department as a student ambassador, I often think about working in schools directly as a psychologist. This would be one of the reasons why I'm interested in applying for the Assistant Educational Psychologist position. Because it's interesting, it will allow me to work in education, a place I feel really comfortable, and it means I can continue to work with children, which is interesting because when I was younger, and even a few years ago, I would say I never wanted to work with children and young people. Yet now, I almost couldn't imagine not working with the children, because students have been a big and very positive part of my life over the past 6 years. Ultimately, I would love to work directly in schools as an educational psychologist with a clinical focus. Since before this podcast episode, the only real information that I had about educational psychology was there were two types: a clinical educational psychologist and a research educational psychologist. So, to wrap up today's episode, educational psychology offers a lot of exciting opportunities to understand how people learn and the different factors that play an important role in forming teaching methods as well as educational strategies. Due to educational psychology explores the learning process through examining different areas of learning behavior, like how developmental, cognitive, social, emotional, amongst other factors impact learning. Then this can all be applied to different areas of education, like educational technology, special education, curriculum design, and more. If you want to work with children and young people, make a difference and contribute to education as a whole, then becoming a educational psychologist could be perfect for you. Therefore, here are some questions to think about at the end of this episode. Does educational psychology interest you? Would you want to work in education and make a difference? What area of educational psychology excites you? Is there anything holding you back from exploring educational psychology in more depth? So, I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode and you got something out of it. I know that I do because I really do want to apply for this job. And ideally, I would get it because being an assistant educational psychologist does sound really good, really fun, and it would be a great learning opportunity. So I am really excited about it. And if I don't get it, then that's okay because there will be other jobs available, and it just means that it's more experience about how to apply for jobs and the like. So it will be interesting for sure. If you know anyone who would enjoy today's episode, then please share it with them. I'm always really grateful when you wonderful people help spread the word about the podcast. And if you want to learn more, then please check out retrieval-based learning, available from all the usual places, and you can get the AI-generated audiobook available from selected audiobook retailers like Spotify, Kobo, Google Play, and Barnes & Noble, and selected library systems like Baker & Taylor, Biblioteca, and Overdrive. And if you want to support the podcast on a monthly basis and get access to tons of early rewards, then please head on over to patreon.com/the Psychology World Podcast. Or if you want to support the podcast on a one-off basis, now you can at buymeacoffee.com/Connor Whiteley. So have a great day, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Found it helpful. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel and follow the podcast on your favourite podcast app. And if you wanted to learn more, then please check out the backlist of the podcast episodes or my books at conwhiteley.net. So have a great day and I'll see you next time.